bypassing, not really bypassing, it's fraud that's based on the use and presence of two-factor authentication. I want to noodle on that for a minute. So you want to base and build your fraud around not circumventing 2FA, but relying on its presence, all right? And I want you to think about that, and we'll get back to that in a minute. And then I kind of want to take you through how we did it. The research is what it is. The numbers are what they are, right? You found this much fraud over this period of time. Yeah, great. I mean, it's interesting, don't get me wrong, but considering what we all do for a living, I think it's a little more interesting to kind of walk you through how we do what it is that we do. So how do we go through 200,000 samples every single day and find the 6 that are important? That might be worthy of a discussion, I think, right? You know, and that kind of research and stuff. So that's kind of where I want to take you to today with this session. So forgive me for a couple of slides that just walk you through what High Roller was, and then we'll kind of get into how we went about doing it. Cool? I encourage you to ask questions along the way. Don't wait until the end for QA or something stupid like that, because I've been drinking these things that Mrs. Skydog has been mixing. So beware. Your question may get a very honest answer. Or I may chuck my phone at you and hit you in the head, one or the other, who knows, right? All right, so let's have a little fun with this too. All right, so what High Roller was is attacks that targeted consumer accounts and business bankings, but only of a certain level. Again, I just want to kind of walk you through a little bit about what it was, and then I'll take you through the depth in just a second. But we're talking about a lot of automation and going after only victims who have a certain monetary value. Oh, now I got to start again. Now I got to start again. Now I got to start again. All right, go out. So the whole point of this was we came in with this idea that we thought these frauds were being committed by a group of people, and that they were not circumventing two-factor authentication, but relying on its presence. And that's kind of different than just cracking seeds, right? You know, that's kind of different than just throwing number variants and see you get the right RSA code and you get in. That's not what this was about. What this was about making fraud look like not fraud. And that's kind of fascinating when you really think about it, right? So we had victims of a certain level, targeting banks of a certain type, all right? And when we go through some of the code, what you'll start noticing is that the bad guys have got an almost insider's view of banking back-end software. Because think about that for a minute. If you want to make fraud look like not fraud, you need to know how they detect fraud, right? All right, so that's kind of the route that we started going around. And how are they doing that? Through automated malware. How are they doing that with Zeus? All right, not the most sophisticated piece of malware in the world, but it's got a lot of stuff in it. And I'll take you through exactly how we went through this ocean of Zeus and SpyEye and got into the 200 or so samples that were actually the samples that we were looking for. So our assumptions going in were that they're targeting specific banks, they're targeting specific brands, and they're targeting specific platforms. A lot of our research started with European banking platforms, because European banking platforms, bang on that wall. All right, tell Jason Scott, shut the fuck up. We can wait. You know this is going to go nowhere but down today, right? So we started looking at European fraud for a couple of different reasons. Number one, there's more developed fraudsters targeting European banking systems. But the interesting thing to us was this, is that why are they targeting European banking that actually has 2FA, chip and pin, and one-time passwords, yet why are they not targeting American banking, which doesn't have any of that, right? Because you think about that for a minute, right? You're going after harder victims, technically, that have more security in place. Why are they doing that? So we started seeing a lot of traffic directed toward European banking. So we started focusing in on certain European banks and started looking for certain things on the wire and certain things on the actual end host. And what we started finding broadly was that it's not server-side code and it's not just client-side code. It's actually a combination of stuff that's doing something on the laptop or on the infected host, stuff that's doing something on the server side, and then an independent command and control function, and then a separate drop zone. So we actually were able to go in and figure out it's not just functionality here, which means if you whack the malware over the head, you only solve part of the problem. There's also this ATS server, automated transaction server, automated fraud server, that has the logic within it that knows how Bank of Germany's back-end functions versus Bank of Netherlands back-end functions. It knows the timeouts, it knows how long the pin is supposed to take, it knows how long the session is supposed to last. And what we also figured out was a lot of these different banks use a lot of the same platforms, and we started looking specifically at this huge world of Zeus malware, and we started saying, wow, this particular Zeus variant targets these specific banking platforms. We didn't put that together at the beginning because we saw they were only targeting such and such bank.com, right? So what we started figuring out along the way, they're targeting common banking platforms. So if you actually look at the slide here, what that is, the big bar is the number of unique malware variants targeting those particular banking institutions and the common banking back ends that a lot of them actually use. So you don't just have malware that says, I'm just capturing credentials and I'm putting the credentials on a drop zone somewhere. Oh, shoot. Sorry about that. So you don't just have simplicity of just capturing credentials. You actually have, and I'll show you the web injects in just a second, you have malware that is targeted to a specific financial institution and a specific banking platform on the back end. So you've got a lot of dynamic action actually going on there. That was kind of cool to us. And want as we are generally to give the bad guys credit, we don't generally like doing that, but there's actually a lot of elegance in the way that this was actually done. You know, you got to call it for what it is, I think, sometimes, right? You know, if you know the host and you know the back end, there's a lot of elegance in the programming of the system. Call it what it is, right? Moving forward here. So what we started seeing was a huge change in how the server-side injects work and how it connects with this automation. I want you to think about a couple of things here for a minute, right? You've got a typical Zeus infection. Zeus we've been dealing with for years, right? All right, we know how Zeus works, we know what it does. But it goes past this man in the browser web injection when you add in this automated transaction server. So think about this, if you're a bank, some of the things you track are username and password, right? You are who you say you are, you know what you say you know. Your IP address, your two-factor authentication. That's generally what the bank relies on to prove you are who you are, coming from where you say you're coming from. All right, when you add in geolocation to that, they say, okay, that IP address, that's the IP address he logs in on these sessions, that's okay too. Throw an automated transaction server into the middle of that, and you have the ability to do parallel transactions. And that's what we started discovering actually happening between what was happening in the browser with the web inject and the interaction with this automated transaction server that it was actually communicating with. I'll show you the code in just a second. So sophisticated server-side injects, blah, 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 blah. Scalability, excuse the marketing terminology here. So you have a spearfish that ultimately leads to a lot of complexity. So sadly, the initial threat vector of them all leads to a lot of sophistication. I got a better screenshot of the web injects and stuff. And by the way, I have an actual package prepared. If you're looking to analyze the web injects and the malware and stuff, just hit me up via email, and I've got some stuff if you guys want to start looking at it on your own and on your own time. So don't worry too much about what's up here on the screen. So you've got the spearfish, which compromises the machine with malware, but the sophistication of the actual attack and the ability to do this kind of side channel 2FA bypass is in the actual web inject. And what we found out was this, is there is about a web inject for every 5 banking systems out there. So for every financial institution, it's not there's one web inject, there's about 10 or 15 in each web inject, geographically located. So what we started finding was we would find Zeus infections in Germany that oddly enough only had web injects for German banks, or it also had Netherlands banks and stuff like that. But we kind of didn't know that going in. We were just looking for web injects and Zeus binaries. But when we started reverse engineering it, we started going, this is pretty interesting. We've got infections in this part of the world that are targeted to banks and financial users in that part of the world. That's kind of the exact opposite of the way malware typically infects things when you think about it, right? We'll get to that in just a second. We'll get to the ATS part of it in just a second. The ATS can be located anywhere, the CNC can be located anywhere, but some of the ones we identified were actually geographically located similar, but we'll get to that in just a second. So you have users who are infected in that part of the world, targeting banks only in that part of the world. And all the user is going to see when they log into their bank account is a bank login. So from the user's perspective, they're logging into their bank account. They're providing their two-factor authentication. And who's European in here? All right, so you guys have chip and pin. You have all kinds of other secondary and third-level authentication factors. It wants that, because what it's actually doing is it's passing all of that credential information to the ATS to actually have the bank transfer X funds to an IBAN account or a mule account. And guess what that looks like to the bank? Just looks like you transacted normally, because you just satisfied every single thing they're looking for fraud. Or I take that back, for anti-fraud, right? You just provided your username and password, you provided the 2FA information, or in some cases chip and pin and one-time pad information, and your IP address is even correct. So from the bank's point of view, fraud just didn't happen, baby. Think about that for a minute. All in that web inject, and these web injects are specific to about 10 financial institutions each. We started seeing this in Europe toward the end of the research period of time, which was about 6 months. We started finally identifying them in the United States. The complicated part is finding the ATS server when it's still live. It's easy to identify them when they've kind of gone offline. There's easy patterns to look for and strings to look for and stuff like that. But I'll get into the replication aspect of it in a minute. Does this make sense so far? Awesome.
So if the ATS is anywhere, how is the IP address forming out, or is this all forming in JavaScript in the victim browser?
It's all in the victim's browser, which is kind of the magic of it, right? You know, it's relying on the functionality of Java to basically say, all right, this is my user agent, this is my IP address, here's my geolocation information. Then when you've entered in all your credential information, bang, that's when the secondary transfers actually start happening. They could be as little as $500 a transfer, they could be as much as $100,000 per transfer, and we'll get to that in just a minute. What we started seeing at the very beginning was going after boutique banking and small banking institutions. So not your cities and not your NLs and stuff, but your smaller boutique banks. The rules of engagement are different, right? They don't have as much, you know, going on in the back end. Not to mention the fact, if you transfer $50,000 from your small banking account to another account, no tracking. All right, it's not like consumer banking, where if you transfer money from your personal account to where it's tracked under 5,000, rules of engagement are different for business to business banking. So this fraud relies on those types of accounts, because they know once the dollars leave their address, gone. No tracking. Pretty damn clever when you get right down to it, right? So they were going to your question and stuff. The ATSs were pretty dispersed. Some of them were in the US, some of them were in Germany, some of them were in Russia. You know, sadly, you always kind of seem to see the same concentrations of IP addresses and stuff. I try not to read too much into that, except for the fact that some hosters either just suck in certain parts of the world, or they're bulletproof in one way, shape, or form, right? But when we started doing geolocation, what we started seeing was this. Oh, bad picture. But this was all one particular Zeus campaign targeting German users and Italian users, and the actual fraudulent transaction server was actually in the UK, but the command and control server was a completely different part of the world. And the drop zone was in yet a different part of the world. I'll get into how we identified these in just a second, but I'm just going over the basic overview to kind of give you a broad understanding of it, right? So that's all really cool, but how the hell did you do all that, right? It's a leading question, by the way. So start with a whole crap load of samples. Who collects their own malware in here and analyzes their own malware in here? How many samples a day do you collect? 100,000? Give me, somebody else throw out a number to me. At 100,000, that's a pretty good number, by the way. Good number. So you figure 100,000 samples, right? Now, I want you to consider this. This is one of the back-end dashboards that we actually use. This is the subsection of the Trojan sample database for Zeus. And this is an hourly feed that comes to me and my team. This scrolls down to well over 1,500 fields. So 1,500 new Zeuses. That's just Zeus, by the way, on every hour, okay? That's stuff that's detected and identified as Zeus. And let me explain something about how a McAfee views the world of malware analysis, right? We have lots of N hosts to protect. You can argue how well we do it, don't give me that, all right? But the point is to I'll say it before you'll say it, so that makes it funny, right? Right? But the point is to provide coverage for a large amount of samples, hundreds and hundreds of thousands every single day, right? So the only thing we want to know is the least amount to identify the sample correctly, right? So I just need to know that it's a Trojan and it's Zeus. I don't need to know the web injects. I don't need to know the victim information. I don't need to know the target information, all right? So to replicate, replication is done at a very top level, just to say it's a Trojan, it's Zeus. Is there coverage for it, yes or no? If the answer is yes, go about your business. If the answer is no, replicate it as much as you need to, get the information you need, get it into the DATs, all right? But we still have all this information on the back end about where it came from and everything else. So what we started figuring out was this, was chances are we have all the samples that we actually need. We just need to replicate them differently. We need to look at the memory differently. We need to possibly replicate them physically, and I'll get to that in just a moment, because most replication is done through VMs, right? VMs works about 60% of the time, depending upon the samples you're throwing at it, all right? It's good for some samples, not good for a lot of other samples. A lot of samples have got what? Anti-VM in it, anti-debugging, and everything else, all right? So it works about 60% of the time, depending upon the classes that you're talking about. Remember that, we'll get back to it. So what we said is this, is let's get a dedicated feed every single hour of every single already identified ZBot, SpyEye, and ICE9, which is another variant of the family sample, and let's push it to a separate directory every single hour. We already know that that's SpyEye. We already know that that's Zeus. That saves us a little bit of time. Then what we want to do is we want to prototype out something called Yara. Anybody familiar with Yara in here? Yara is it, baby. Yara in and of itself just allows you to run analysis against binaries, all right? It's actually like AV in a lot of ways. It lets you look for strings and do all kinds of things. But what we figured out was this, is we actually don't need to use it to identify the fact that it's malware. We already know it's malware. We already know it's Zeus, all right? We need to look for the strings that we're looking for. Sometimes you can do that with the binary. Sometimes you can't do that with the binary. Sometimes you actually have to run the binary and actually get the memory dump. But looking at some of the stuff, and I'll give you specific examples of the scripts that we started throwing at it, it allows us to take 1,500 to 2,000 samples per hour and get the 10 that satisfy what we think Operation High Roller is actually doing, all right? Then we can re-replicate those 10 to 20 samples fully and actually run the web injects. Let it launch a browser, let it log into a bank account and actually get all the information. Most of the times when an AV company replicates malware, it's only to simply identify it's Zeus, it's this, it's that, it's the other thing, get it in the DATs, get it out. We want to use it as a down select, run a further set of rules against it, and find the 5% that are actually the ones we're looking for. And this took a long time to actually get to this because we've got a lot of malware, and when we went into this research, sad to say, in a lot of ways we didn't know completely what we were looking for. We knew there was a web inject functionality, and we knew there was back-end functionality, but we weren't specifically looking for anything.
When you're doing that, are you potentially enabling fraud?
We'll get to that. We'll get to that in just a second. The problem we run into, and it's part of our third phase, is to actually use live accounts. Is to actually work with banks to actually give us live accounts that are actually tracked accounts, because that's where some of the web injects actually fail. Is it'll spawn the session correctly, but if you don't give it a valid account, surprise, surprise, it doesn't log into anything, and you don't get the ATS, and you don't get the CNC or anything like that. So we kind of get foiled at that part of it unless you just give it account credentials that are actually valid. So part of phase 3 is to actually do it live with live accounts and stuff, and we'll get to that in just a second. So a lot of times we have to rely on just the IP address of the transaction server and the fact that the log files are unprotected and stuff. We'll get to that in just a minute. But so we're not enabling fraud. I would actually like to track the fraud. If banks would give me 10 or 15 accounts, that would actually be really cool if you think about it. If When I get to the final screens, when you see we have the ability to detect the financial institution targets, think about that for a minute. You know, work with financial institution X and let them give you tracked accounts, right? That's pretty cool. All right, then you can actually log in, let the automated transaction server do its job. Let the command and control server do its job. Map the trail. That gets really, really interesting. We'll get to that in just a second. So we prototyped out this little Yara installation, and we started saying, well, why Yara? Again, Yara lets you look for specific strings in a binary or in memory. I encourage you to spend time with this little binary because it's a heavy-duty scripting language that I can't recommend enough. To give you an idea of who thinks it's cool, VirusTotal thinks it's cool, all right? They have a lot of binaries, you know, so they use heavily Yara scripting. And again, you don't get everything from it. I don't want you to think this is a way to say, oh, I found the one sample I'm looking for. It allows you to go from 20,000 samples to 1,000 samples, to then re-replicate to get a smaller set of samples, to get the 2 or 3 binaries that you're actually looking for, and it's extremely efficient. To give you an idea of how quick it is, when we throw our Yara scripts, and we have 10 or 12 different Yara scripts that I'll show you in a minute, it takes about 2 minutes to process about 2,000 samples through Yara and actually get the output from it and stuff. So again, it's pretty kick-ass stuff, and you actually can have VM replication routines and everything. Very cool. So moving on. The way we actually do it is this, is we have a series of scripts that we'll actually throw at it. And what's kind of neat is the fact that we actually have an awful lot of malware. And we have a lot of internal tools that allow us to connect to the back end and pull whatever samples that we actually want to pull. So every single hour we will pull down the entire ZBot or SpyEye snapshot from that last hour and then run all of those different Yara sets of rules at it in an effort to go from 1,500 samples to the 15 that we actually really want to look at. A lot of noise, very little signal, but Yara allows us to do this ridiculously quick down select to then re-replicate the samples. Some of these don't work when you throw them at some of the samples. Like I said, it's about a 60% success rate when you're throwing Yara at certain binaries through VM. Not everything replicates in a VM environment. A lot of stuff crashes out. Sometimes malware doesn't work. You know, lots of different things. And by the way, hit me up via email later. I'm happy to share our Yara scripts and our deployment and our ideas on it and stuff like that. Glad to do it. It's a great project. So we will then re-replicate these samples fully in physical hardware and then re-throw these same scripts at it. So who actually reverses their own malware? You got to capture keys and figure out what the XOR and stuff. All right, you actually don't have to do any of that. If you actually replicate the sample on a physical machine for ZBot and things like that, what you want to do is you want to analyze memory. You want to analyze running memory. That's where the web injects are. That's where your browsers, that's where all of the good, juicy stuff is. So that makes things a little operationally challenging, and that made it operationally challenging for us is replicating 2 samples, 3 samples a day, not a big deal. You rebuild your hardware, you replicate another sample. Do that shit across 5,000 samples. Have a nice day, all right? A little more challenging. So some of the issues we run into is actual physical replication, because unless you're physically replicating, you're not going to get the memory snapshots, you're not going to get the web injects, and you're not going to get the dynamic behavior from the ATS that you're looking for. So that was kind of one of the things that was holding us back at the initial stages of replication, was only doing it through VMs and stuff like that. And again, you have to understand the sheer volume of malware that we actually look at on a daily basis. It's a big honking pile of malware. So we will run this twice, and we will then take all of that output. For instance, these are the strings that we will actually run at it. Again, hit me up an email later. I'm happy to share the strings with you. This works about 60% of the time in some variants of ZBot. Not every piece of malware can you throw and look for encrypted strings in. Some of them it works, some of them it doesn't work. Some malware is really effective. I'll show you some shots of Game Over, which is a nasty little piece of Zeus that has peer-to-peer functionality in it. The great thing is, all the encrypted strings are the same. If you know what encrypted strings to look for, it's magic, because you can identify that stuff with 100% accuracy. I'll show you the script in a minute. But this works very, very, very well 60% of the time. The other 40% of the time, it sucks. So again, take that for what it's worth. We'll also throw the actual target strings at it. So we're actually looking for specific web pages and for specific URL strings, which again are in the actual web index. Sometimes you can get them through the binary. Sometimes you can actually get them without unpacking the binary. It just depends on the binary. It can be very successful. It can blow chunks. You know, again, that's the good thing about having 1,500 new samples this hour, is if I only got 3% success, I have 1,500 more samples next hour to throw it against. Maybe we'll have better success and stuff. And so again, you start looking and down selecting, which really becomes the magic with what you want to do. So what this yields is this, is after we've gone through 2 or 3 loops, we actually get usable information. The detection information to me is not very interesting. Don't get me wrong when I say that. It's important to protect people against Zeus. It's important to have coverage in the DATs. But that's not what interests me at the end of the day. What interests me at the end of the day is actually getting the intelligence out of the binaries and actually connecting dots together. And you cannot do that unless you fully replicate in as real an environment as you can. VM is not going to cut it. And we have ways of making VM look like not VM, but still, it doesn't work 100% every single time. So by going through a couple of replication cycles, when we get those 10 or 15 binaries that we know are the ones we're looking at, that's when physical replication begins. That's when we actually will use volatility and some other memory sucking programs to actually pull the financial targets out. It will also give us every single drop zone and every single command and control and ATS. It's all in the web index if you can replicate the sample correctly and then capture it through volatility or Yara or something like that. All the information is actually in there provided you replicate your samples correctly and provided you have enough samples. I mean, if you're only doing this against 10 or 15, you're going to go, Marcus doesn't know what he's talking about. I don't get anything. That's because it's only 10 or 15 samples. We have to do tens of thousands of these to actually get the individual campaigns that we're actually looking for. So it's a lot of noise, very little signal, but when you get the signal is magic. Because what's great about the ones on the right, where the ATSs are actually, the automated transaction servers are hosted, they're hosted without directory permissions or anything. In every single case, I have never found any directory structure on any of the automated fraud servers to be protected. So that's great because you could just immediately download all the log files. That's how we did the fraud versus attempted fraud analysis. The admin panels are usually password protected with what? It's amazing, isn't it? It's amazing. Throw that dictionary, you know, throw one of those, it works it's ridiculous. It's either blank with a password of admin or admin with a password of password. I mean, it's amazing how often that works on one of those servers, I kid you not. Then you can, you actually have the ability to take that information, the one that's in the box on the right, pull down all the log files, and that will actually give you the actual fraud amounts of the account that's compromised, the IBAN account that was sent to, and the mule account it was then transferred to. It's all there in all of their log files in a file handily called logs.txt. So all of that is actually within the directory structure. You just have to know how to actually massage the binaries to the point where you want to replicate it fully. Run Yara against a fully replicated memory snapshot. You will get every bit of juicy information that you actually want, possibly even including where these fuckers live. You know, you can start doing that kind of analysis, which I think becomes very, very interesting. So what we will then take is we will then build out some automated reporting. We have a technology that allows us to write very, very aggressive detections that are not seen by end users because the detections are simply reported back to us. So like we have the ability to look for a certain key in the presence of a certain detection. So you're not going to see an alert on it. Nothing is going to happen on the end user or in the end host. It's just something is going to get reported back. So if we want to look for a key that we know is only going to be present in the case of a certain rootkit, we can write certain very aggressive detections that allow us to do that. So what we did was we then took that information and said, those are the MD5s that we're looking for. Of those tens of thousands of binaries that we actually looked at, it came down to 5 or 6 types of MD5s that we were actually looking at that had all functionality. We were then able to map those to the families that they were found within and all the alerts that would correspond to it, and then track the IP addresses that were actually reporting those types of detections globally and stuff. So that's how we were able to pinpoint that person, that person, that person, that person, that person, that person, and then do further analysis to say that person's machine was compromised and reporting to that ATS over there, and the drop zone went over there. It took about 6 months of lots of caffeine and a large amount of Jägermeister. But that's how we roll, right? So what are we looking ahead with? Recently, we've been looking at a piece of malware called Game Over, which is a pretty nasty version of Zeus that if you're not familiar with, you really want to start analyzing, because this is a little bit old school, because this thing is peer-to-peer. It uses peer-to-peer for its channel of communication and stuff like that. But what's awesome about Game Over is all the strings are encrypted, and they're the same about 95 to 99% of the time. So you can use Yara, again, to start looking for only specific patterns in those particular binaries. We've only found about 5% of all the binaries that we're actually looking at, or the Game Over Trojans that we're actually looking for, that we suspect are being used in a certain type of fraud. So it's very early stage, but that Yara rule that you're looking at right there is 99% accurate. If it actually says that's game over, it's game over. It's the Game Over Trojan. You can be that precise as long as you know the strings that you're actually looking for. It took a good 40 hours of work to get to that script, but it's very, very beneficial, especially when you have hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of malware samples that you can throw your Yara script at every single day. Not necessarily beneficial if you've only got 10 or 15, but if you've got an order of magnitude like we have, very, very beneficial. Make sense? Cool. If it doesn't make sense, I don't really care. That's not true, I do, but I want you to think that I love you, So what are we doing going forward? This is a big deal for us right now, is because of the amount of malware that we look at on a daily basis, we have to replicate things through VM. It just wouldn't work operationally otherwise. But in order to get the intelligence out of the binaries that we really want, past simple identification, when you think about it, who has actually looked at this? Who's actually reversed Dooku or Stuxnet or any of those? All right, it's not a small amount of work. All right, it takes a team of hours and hours and hours and hours to do this, and you can't do a lot of that stuff through VM replication. It doesn't work because it's baked into the malware to shut itself down. So a lot of the stuff we're doing going forward is figuring out how to do large-scale physical host replication. It's becoming more and more important because just about every piece of malware has got anti-VM and stuff in it anyway. So that's a big deal for us going forward. Expanding our Yara usage, we're actually including modules in our back end to start using Yara more and more. Again, we're not using it for detection, we're using it for down selecting. I suggest that you guys take a long look at Yara when you have some time. It's not an end-all be-all for all things, but it's a very good way of taking a large amount of malware that you already know is a Trojan and figuring out, this is my Zeus category, this is my ICE9 category, this is my Game Over category.
I'm guessing it's probably nothing magical. It's probably scalability or the ability to automate. But why not use emulation instead?
It just comes down to certain malware samples don't replicate and emulate well. So at the end of the day, you're going to fail the least when you do physical replication. And again, it's a scalability issue. I wouldn't do this against our 100,000 to 200,000 samples every single day, but I will do this against the down-selected 100 samples every single day. That's the ones we will invest in throwing physical replication at. Emulation works for certain things. The problem we run into is, again, the injects don't always work in those environments. It's just buggy, but they will work every single time in the physical environment. It just depends if you've got the bucks to throw at doing the test bed versus doing the VM bed or the emulated bed. I hear you. It's just from the experience of doing 100,000 automated sample processes a day, 60% of them fail through emulation too. So it's just one of those things. I wish there was a better answer, but it's just the way it is, sadly. So Yara for down selects is very, very, very effective. This going forward is something that I'm trying to do, is to actually work with, when we actually take the export of all the binaries and say these are our 12 targets from this last hour, I want to be able to give it to financial institution X and say, look, these guys are targeting you. Maybe we have an opportunity here to map out their whole ecosystem of how they actually conduct fraud. That's a scary question to talk to bankers and financial guys and accountants and stuff about, right? Because you're letting fraud actually happen. But if it's a monitored bank account, I would argue it's a little bit different. So going forward, I would really love to be able to get 5, 10 monitored accounts from big financial institutions and actually map out the whole ecosphere live. So let's say we actually have the ability to detect all the targets live every single hour. Wouldn't it be cool when you actually replicate those samples to actually say, okay, that's city, or that's .nl, or that's .deutsch. All right, I've got an account for that. Let me automate that. Let me have a down select that says, okay, when this victim comes along, push that account credential to it with this 2FA information or this chip and pin information. Then we're not guessing how they conduct fraud. Then we're actually mapping out how they conduct fraud. Then you're seeing the transactions, you're getting all the logs, you're following the trail, you're getting it right down to the mule account. You're not just analyzing some log file, you know, you're actually mapping it out live as it happens. So we can get about 95% of the way there, but the attribution trail is going to fail unless we can get the bank account information, which is kind of my big thing going forward. So if you own a bank, come and talk to me, give me an account. If you don't, I can understand that. Again, this gets into, you know, questions of accountability, right? But I again think that we were real specific in high roll to say this is actual fraud versus attempted fraud, all right? So the reason we split that out is this, is the logs that actually had account transfer, mule account, was successful fraud with the actual dollar amount. We put that in one column. The ones that actually failed, we put in a different column. So we actually broke out what we considered successful frauds and transfers versus just attempted ones. So attempted was like 2.6 billion or something like that. But the actual committed was like 75 million euro. It's a big number, all right? You know, and if you could show that kind of quantification, maybe we can get them to start giving us some accounts, start pumping that information and mapping out the ecosphere. Because then it kind of begs the question of what you can do with law enforcement, right? So if I can then say, all right, this is not just the financial institutions that are being targeted, because I have all the data right out of the web injects and right out of the live running malware, but if I can actually map out the actual transfer system, that's what law enforcement actually needs. And we actually have the ability to do something good instead of just whacking another piece of malware over the head, which is kind of an exercise in futility when you really get right down to it, because there's going to be more malware tomorrow. This is at least interesting, you know, mapping out where it's going and actually helping track these guys down. I think that becomes very interesting research, and it's doable. We can do, number one. Number two, we're at the point where we just need the bottom two right there, and you know, then it's all automated at that point. We're now producing daily feeds. So if you were to, let's say, want a feed of just game over Trojans that target a particular bank or a particular ACH fraud, we're actually producing those now. If you wanted a feed of just financial institutions in Germany, we're producing those now. If you wanted a feed of just financial institutions in the Netherlands, we're actually producing that now too, based upon Yara, down selects, and a couple of recursive actual passes of replication with malware. So it's possible to do all of it. You know, it just comes down to, is the investment going to go forward? Any questions on that? Of course you have a question.
And you consider using a worldwide geographic distribution for your
Yep. We've already looked at it. We've looked at geo stuff in some ways for some things. It's good for some things, not good for others. You know, we're lucky that we've got a pretty big footprint for stuff like that, but we're looking at it. You know, it comes down to collecting information differently than most customers are comfortable with us collecting information from. You know, when you think about it, right, you don't want us to see a lot of stuff that's on your machine, right? We're a vendor. You don't want us to see, but at the end of the day, we can collect a lot of information. We can map out, going back to this particular slide, I can tell what piece of malware is on what machine at what time of day. The back-end automation allows us to map all of that stuff out. You just get into some very creepy areas when you get into specific, when you add geolocation and some of the other geodispersity into that. We have the ability to do it. It's just those things that make people uncomfortable. I'm not against it, I'm not necessarily for it. I've just been on the receiving end of people yelling at me for bringing it up. But I think it's a great idea. Geodistribution and everything else.
Have you tried working with the payment platform providers, maybe get like a fake data set up?
That's actually one of the things we're in the middle of doing right now, is to actually set up fake banking platforms and stuff. The problem we ran into, and this was a good learning experience for me, is telling people their back-end fraud analysis and detection system doesn't work, and providing them with quantifiable information about how it doesn't work doesn't end well all the time. You know, so it's one of those learning experiences where, had I thought it through, that's what I should have done. That's what we should have done when we did this, is actually set up our own banking platform to actually own the entire supply chain, so to speak. So we're actually looking at doing that now. Hit me up later on if you've got some ideas on how to do that. I would love to have that conversation, because we've had the discussion internally, but you know, again, I'm a threat guy. I'm not a banking back-end guy. So if you've got the knowledge, we've got the power. But we had that discussion on doing it so that way we could own the whole thread. I got to tell you, the feedback when we actually work with certain banks was fascinating. Certain banks in the Netherlands and Germany and some of the other areas were like, you guys got it. That's how it works. That's how they bypass or use our 2FA and MFA. That's how they do it. You're the only ones that get it. Others, I've never been called more dirty words in my life. I have never been called, yeah, you'd think I have. I have been, that's not good. I'm married, so yeah, I have been called more dirty words than that. But it's just like, how dare you say something like that? 2FA is impregnable, you can't bypass it, you can't break it. I was like, I didn't say they broke it. I said they designed fraud that relies on it. Or, you know, so it's just one of those things that made people very, very uncomfortable. And that's why, if anybody's read the actual report, we don't talk about the 2FA bypass or 2FA enable part an awful lot, because it makes people very, very nervous that even chip and pin, yeah, even chip and pin. How about one-time password? Done. Doesn't matter. If it's going through the browser and you're entering it through the browser, if you've got secondary, it'll defeat it. I mean, the secondary will defeat high roller because it's out of band, right? Out of band would defeat it. But in band through the browser, doesn't matter what credentials you're passing to it. It wants your 2FA information, so the transaction has username, password, 2FA information, IP address. That's all the bank needs to know to go, ah, that's Dave Marcus. Sure, I'll transfer $50,000 to that IBAN account in the Netherlands. Why wouldn't I? He provided everything I needed to know. That's exactly what that does. Hit me up later. Love to talk about that. Any other questions, guys? Yes, sir. Stuff like that. I mean, I can talk about certain things that we do proprietarily, and I can't talk about certain things we do proprietarily. So hit me up later and we can talk a little bit more about that. It's ripped down, it's a lot of what you would think it is, but it's an order of magnitude bigger. And who owns us? Intel. Hardware ain't an issue. You know, so it's building out big replication beds, but the tear down and rebuild is different. And then throw into the fact that, you know, more and more of the Zeus stuff sometimes has MBR malware in it and other kinds of, you know, you run into other issues of even replicating physical hardware. So it becomes operationally challenging, sir. You know, but that's the route we're going down.
Have you seen any signs of malware trying to detect test-bed environments?
Oh, sure. All the time. All the time. That wasn't to you, by the way. That was to him. That would be rude for me to actually flip off a guy in the audience who's asking me a question. That's a great question. I want to hear your comment. It's true. It's only one. Just like the three people in here, everybody else is just walking in. But in answer to your question, we run into stuff that either tries to detect detection, shut down detection, or simply run 12 or 13 threads. So you'll have the one thread that's doing the web inject, and there'll be 3 other threads that are watching the threads that are doing the actual injection. That's very, very common. You know, and again, you can only go so far in VM replication to stop that kind of stuff, because one of the threads is to look for specific things that are only available in the presence of VM replication, right? Or certain CPU addresses that are reminiscent of replication, and it'll shut itself down. Happens all the time. Again, that's why it's only works 60% of the time. Otherwise, you've got to throw it into hardware. Very frustrating. Can be very frustrating sometimes. It's a good question, sir. Yep.
trying to develop that thing.
Yep.
Is it only those guys that have the protection that's really good?
The problem is this, is it used to be only in certain samples that we would see things. By the way, the thread you're looking for is simply kill thread. If you're actually looking for the thread that's designed to kill AV or anything else, it's simply kill thread. You know, so it's a common call to actually use, but it's just baked into a toolkit. So every time a toolkit produces, you know, every time Black Hole creates a binary, it's got kill threads built into it. You know, so at one time it was some dude's hardcore work that was only seen a small amount of times. Then it gets incorporated into Black Hole 2, and everything else, and everything's then got a kill thread in it. Some of the stuff that's more prevalent doesn't work all the time. You know, it's like 60% of the stuff that you can't replicate. It's the same thing for some of the kill threads. Sometimes it just doesn't work. And not all kill threads work on all of our competitor stuff equally. Some things work on us, some things don't work on us, some things work on Symantec. So it's sometimes just they have to write their malware for a very broad audience, and not every single thing works on every single vendor equally. And we're pretty good at self-protection, just because we look at memory a little bit differently, but we're suspect, you know, to some other areas of evasion and shutdown, and just like everybody else is. But that's a good question. Any other questions out there, guys? Yes, no, maybe so? Come on, another question. No? No? Nothing? Well, I think I might be able to cut you bastards loose a few minutes early. Oh my God, I'm actually 2 minutes under, so we can sing, do the wave. If not, I will say, listen, hit me up later during DerbyCon if you want a copy. I've packaged up the web injects. I'm even happy to share some samples, and I'm happy to share some of the Yara stuff with you guys as well if you're looking to do some Yara replication on your own. What I would ask is this, is what we share with you, you share with others. Don't be a stingy bastard. So if you're going to do Yara stuff, share it with the rest of the community, please. We all need to benefit from each other. With that, thanks a lot for the playing along. Oh, wait, last slide. Oh, no worries, brother. Don't worry about it. Send you everything. I'll bundle up a binary for you and send it over. You're welcome to. Really? There's if you're familiar, there's a writer, Brooks Kubik, who wrote Dinosaur Training and stuff like that. He turned me onto this gym in a basement. Well, then go check out. It's actually got power racks built into the basement walls. Yeah, with like 5,000 pounds of plates. Pretty cool. Nobody wants to squat with that. I'll check it out. That's all? That's the price. Sir! What's up? Good to see you, man. No. Emails. Years ago, that's right. That's right. Good to see you, man. Sure. David_Marcus@mackie.com. Yeah, absolutely. I don't have. Hit me up later. My cards are in my bag. They're in the speaker. You and I need to have a long conversation. Yeah. Hit me up later today. I'll give you my card. Let's have a chat. Because this is